Rooted in British Columbia soil are some of the largest and oldest trees in the world. In these old-growth forests, western red cedar and yellow cedar can live longer than 2,000 years and reach sizes over 4 meters in diameter. Cedar trees also have some of the highest timber values in coastal forests, and as a result, have been targeted by the forest industry for logging. But to First Nations in the area, cedar is more than just a commodity. It's the tree of life, a cultural keystone species because of its diverse uses in traditional aspects of First Nation life. The largest and highest quality old-growth cedars are needed for some of the most important cultural purposes, like house poles, canoes, and as totem poles. These cedars are known as monumentals.
Cedar is what connects us all up and down the coast of British Columbia. There's 3 or 4 different language groups, but we all have cultural cedar ceremonies that start our traditional ceremonies. And so that's really a tie that binds us.
Community members often see truckloads of big cedar trees tumbling down the highway out of their territories, and they ask me, how much cedar's out there? Is there enough cedar to support traditional use for our current generation and future generations? And up until recently, we didn't really have answers to those questions.
Logging has been a massive contributor to the economy here on the West Coast since before Confederation. And overall, those old massive trees have been the primary target of timber companies, to the point where they've almost disappeared from Vancouver Island. Today, loggers harvest old-growth and second-growth trees, but the difference in market value between them is stark. Where old-growth cedar, a monumental cedar, can pull in $450 per cubic meter for lumber quality grades, second growth pulls in only about $300. If logging continues without any sort of management protocol in place for these large cultural cedars, there won't be enough of them relative to the needs of the nation over the next 100 years.
It's important for us to continue to work with our neighboring nations to make sure that communities that need access to this monumental cedar have it, and we're also able to learn from each other's mistakes from the management that's happened since, colonization, for lack of a better term.
Recognizing that monumental cedars breathe life into First Nation culture, it became clear to First Nation leaders that the need for a large cultural cedar stewardship strategy was imminent.
Nanwakolas Council is a collection of First Nations who've come together for various land and resource management planning reasons over 10 years ago, and have come together to find a way to build relationships that give us the ability to plan our communities and our territories in accordance with our way of life.
To find out what it takes for a cedar tree to make a good big house log, canoe, or totem pole, the Nanwakolas Council knew they needed to speak to the carvers themselves.
Yeah, it's nice if it's like around 2.5, 3 feet. That's like ideal. Then straight as an arrow, like no knots or hardly any knots. I mean, that's great. Tight grain. No rot through the inside. That's kind of like what we love to carve, just because it's so nice and creamy and it's easy to work with.
With training material developed by the nation's own carvers on how to identify potential monumental cedars, surveyors from member nations went through a training course, learning about surveying equipment, how to conduct transects in dense forest, and how to keep track of the monumental cedars, if they could be found.
I call it boot camp. So we're going out into the forest in all sorts of different terrain, and we are identifying cedars that have a diameter over 100 centimeters. Say for a totem pole, it can't have any really big knots on the tree, so that a carver could use that for a specific project.
It's definitely comforting to see big trees at the end of the day. Very exciting to come across a canoe log. It's just, it's amazing.
While totem poles mark traditional territories, they also represent stories and belief systems. In essence, they are guardians of First Nation cultures.
And the art of carving and the final product tells and speaks of a story, right? It relates to our origin stories, it relates to our culture and specific moments in time that have happened that were monumental for our ideology and philosophy of who we are as Comox, and for me, Kwakwaka'wakw.
Randy Frank has been carving for most of his life. For him, laying hands on these ancient cedars is a way to tap into a sense of belonging in his nation.
I think it's important for us to be able to stand up our poles and kind of say whose land it is, and represent the band with artwork, with the totem poles. I think it's very important for our youth to kind of experience that as well and feel that same sense of belonging, I guess, right?
You don't just grow a 300-year-old tree overnight. And so it's really important for us to continue to grow our relationships with the users of forest resources to understand that this crucial cultural component has to be part of these planning practices.
It's not easy. Obviously, we don't know exactly what the needs of the nations are. We don't know exactly if our predictions are accurate, but it's the initial building blocks to start to understand, if logging is going to take place in an area, how many need to be protected and in which manner.
Equipped with a large cultural cedar strategy, which includes new forest management guidelines developed by the Nanwakolas Council and a database describing the location of monumental cedars, carvers and their communities will have a much easier time accessing culturally suitable trees in their territories, thus continuing traditions and practices that connect generations through millennia.